the industry globally. So we're going to talk about the News Media Bargaining Code. All right. So hello, Chris. Hello, Jennifer. How are you? I can see people joining. So so let's go back in time. All right. So we are dawn of COVID. All right. So early 2000. And Australia's made it very clear to publishers that it's going to pass a bargaining code that's going to be encapsulated in the law, that's going to require the big tech platforms to pay publishers for using content on their platforms. And this has come after a long period of strong lobbying by all of the news industry, broadcast TV, print, digital, radio, everybody. Hi, I'm getting a wave. And so the government really steps up, and Australia takes the lead and decides that it's going to lead the rest of the world in this new approach to making platforms pay. And it was a really interesting time because we had the head of our anti-competition commission, the ACCC in Australia, was a guy called Rod Sims. And he'd had a bit of a legendary run as the head of the ACCC. He had won everything he'd taken on, oil, tobacco, the banks. And he pulled them all off, and I think he was 4 for 4. And so he decided to take on big tech, and this was kind of his swan song. He was going to be 5 for 5, and he was going to get his name on some unit at Harvard, right? It was going to be one of those amazing things. And his determination to pull off this incredible feat coincided with the self-interest of a fast-rising politician here, who was then the treasurer and was odds-on to be the next prime minister. And so what they discovered, what the politicians saw, was the kind of kerching moment, in their minds was, this is a vote winner. Like, people are into this, right? And so if we get the big tech platforms to pay, it's going to protect the news industry, the public like this. So what you've got a highly motivated wannabe prime minister as treasurer, and you've got a highly motivated head of the competition commission, both of whom are exactly headed north on the same trajectory, which happens once in a lifetime. And so you had the news industry asking for it, and 2 people that could make it happen, both saying yes. It was the perfect scenario. Go, please.
Where's the public at this point? What's the kind of Australian sort of public opinion around platforms and social? Interested, not interested? Is it a kind of talking point at this point?
It is a talking point. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the number one thing on their agenda, but I think that the narrative that we are going to get the platforms to pay so we can have quality local news did work, and it did work with the public. Yeah, and please, there's Australians on the line. I can see them dropping in. So please send your messages and your notes in, on your views, because I'm going to have some fairly strong views in here, and everybody has a very different view of how this went down. So I think we should put it out in the open. Yeah, go on.
Well, it's just a quick. So there'll be people here who haven't spent much time in Australian media. So just that difference between national media and local media. So local media in Australia is both state and very local, isn't it? And it's much more important in some ways than perhaps there isn't really a state equivalent media in the UK.
It takes 18 hours to deliver a newspaper from Sydney to Central Australia. So it's difficult to get the metro papers. The population is on the coast and in the metro areas, and so they get the papers. But I can't remember exactly how many. Somebody will be able to correct me, but I think something like a third or just over a third of the population lives in rural Australia. So they're only really served by TV. It's some patchy internet there, and so they are really served by those local papers. And so what you effectively had was a perfect scenario where the opportunity existed for politicians to pass a law backed by a very, very deep and detailed investigation by the Anti-Competition Commission that was going to require the tech platforms to pay. And the reason that I know that this was an excellent piece of law, and I know that's going to tweak so many people on this call, but the reason that I know that it was a really good piece of law is because the tech platforms hated it. Absolutely hated it. And what they were worried about was that, A, it gave them very little room to maneuver. Right? If this law gets passed, we either leave Australia, right, which is going to cost us a lot of money, or we stay and we pass a precedent which will be copied around the rest of the world, which costs us even more money. So we either say no to 15 billion, which is what they earn here, or we say okay, and we might cost even more. Really difficult. And so what they did was they threw their biggest weapon, which shows you how worried they were. So both first Meta and then Google both said we're going to turn news off. Now, that's quite a big deal, right? This hadn't happened anywhere else at this point. And so we had a situation where Meta was first. And so all of the news sites, anybody that had news in their tag on their Facebook page or Instagram page, just went dark overnight. Now, the problem was that also included, during COVID, it included all of the medical authorities, it included half of the police forces, it included every domestic violence charity in the country. It also included all the news brands. Okay.
Yeah.
So we were in the middle of COVID. People were trying to keep their children safe. COVID was still new then, and no one really quite knew, whether this was the zombie apocalypse or this was just going to pass. And so suddenly everybody was cut off from direct news content. And so very risky, but shows you how determined they were to kill this law in the cradle. And then Google then followed suit and started to not run news.
Can I just ask Ricky, when you say turned off news, so it's for Facebook, because a lot of that is, at the time, this is still when a lot of publishers are publishing news on Facebook, but it's also people sharing links. So they not just shut off the publishers, block the links as well.
No, the links were still working, but all of the sites of all the publishers went dark. So if you went to the national broadcaster, the ABC, or you went to News Corp here, it basically said this site has been blocked due to the News Media Bargaining Code. And if you went to Google and you did a search and you said, give me a story from, we have a paper here called the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, give me a story from the Daily, so you'd search, tell me the Daily Telegraph's coverage of this. It would redirect you to a random newspaper in America. So, literally you'd ask specifically for this and you'd click the link and it would take you to USA Today, or it might take you to the Seattle Times. And so this was a really big deal. So what I did at the time was I got a group of my friends, and Matt's on this call, you'll remember this. I got a group of my friends and sent all of my staff and friends out to coffee shops and said, go and talk to, or first of all, go to the coffee shops and listen to what people are saying about this. Are they livid that Google's going to be turned off and they're going to turn, like, we can't live without it?
Yeah.
Or have they got a different view? What's happening? And the entire conversation in the coffee shops that I got back was people were saying, okay, so Google's going. So, all right, well, what other search engines are there? There's one called Ecosia, right? I think there's Bing. What are they? And so it was really interesting to me. I was suddenly woken up to this fact that it wasn't actually terror that Google's going to turn the lights off. It was, well, we'll just find another torch.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting. And on Meta, people just didn't really have an opinion. They were just like, so. And so that was really interesting. So the days are counting down to the enactment of this law. And what's going to happen when this law is passed is that the Google and Meta have to negotiate in good faith with the publishers, and all of the publishers have been given special permission and dispensation to be allowed to negotiate collectively.
Yeah.
And Google and Meta have to negotiate in good faith with them. And so
just on that collective point, for everyone who doesn't spend their life in media companies worrying about that kind of thing. One of the things that over the years the publishers have talked a lot about with government is, hey, look, this is kind of unfair because there's a global Facebook or a global Google, and they're talking to every publisher. But if I, as a publisher, talk to another publisher and we agree how we're going to talk to Facebook, that's collusion. And under most competition regulation, you can't do that. So there's a massive advantage in all these negotiations with the sort of asymmetric information between what the platform knows, because they've talked to every publisher, and what publishers are legally allowed to know. And hence why, the collective thing was quite a big part of that deal, wasn't it? That they could actually talk to each other and agree.
First time ever. Yeah. And so the publishers all got together and went to a meeting. Google came. Google sat down and Google had a conversation. Meta turned up late, brought an academic, said that they'd done the research and they'd assessed that the value of the news industry was zero. Yeah. And so they then left. That was the end of that. That was not considered to be in good faith. Yeah.
Come on, give us colour. Where are you? Where are you? Are you in a Sydney hotel room? Are you in a kind of
Me,
as in,
when this happened.
where was this meeting? Where was that meeting
Oh,
held?
I wasn't there. I should make it clear. I wasn't
Mm.
at the meeting, but I've spoken to lots of people that were. I was in the States at the time, but no, the meeting was just held at. I can't remember. I don't know actually, to be honest. But I do know what the reaction was.
Mm.
I got quite a lot of incoming, and
Yeah.
so the result of that was that they then went straight to the government and said this isn't in good faith, right?
Mm.
And the government kind of fired a shot across Meta's bows, and then Meta said, "Well, we're just going to cut off news. Then we're not interested." And there was a get-out clause in the court in the legal paper that basically said that if Meta didn't carry news, didn't have to pay for it. Yeah, so it could
Yeah.
just turn it off. And I
Yeah.
suppose that was something that people have learned from since. So there's been some learnings as well. But anyway, Meta's just not playing. It's leaving. I'm done. See ya. Bye. And I kind of get it. Then Google said, we're not happy with this law either. But then it started to do some negotiations behind the scenes. So as we're counting down to the deadline of this law being enacted and these two big tech companies being effectively sanctioned by the government, okay,
Mm.
right in with days to go. I mean, I'm sitting like every single day on tenterhooks. This is like
Mm.
the thing I've been shouting about for 15 years is like moments away. It's like the fucking moon landing, right? and I'm waiting for this moment. And then rumours start spreading that one of the media companies here has done a deal, a backroom deal, a quiet deal, a private deal. And then over the next, which was confirmed incredibly quickly. Yep.
And
I think
how many days out is this from?
less than a week.
Right.
Yeah. And so you can only imagine there've been frantic calls taking place out of
Yeah.
sight. And so then Google puts out a press release, says we've done this deal with Channel 7 and blah, 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 blah. We are delighted to be supporting this news initiative. This is exactly the kind of thing we want to do. Please have a look at our wonderful marketing team who've been working feverishly on this in the background, 3,000 miles away and don't give a shit. It's kind of one of those. Yeah.
Mm.
Sorry, a bit cynical. And then, of course, a check was paid. Yeah. Rumored to be, I don't know, 20 million, 25 million. In fact, it was rumored to be about 25 million bucks because I immediately did the numbers and that was about enough money to run the Sydney studio of Channel 7 for 1 month. So it wasn't exactly a land-breaking deal.
Yeah.
But then what happened was there was a pile-on, so all the other publishers jumped in and all the big publishers kind of lined up and all the big publishers took a check and Google paid and then afterwards Meta paid. So suddenly the law is kind of sitting fallow over here.
Mm. Just go back a bit, Ricky. So when you say they paid, how many checks do you think got written? And is this the big guys, the small guys, the medium guys, the locals? Everybody out in the middle of Darwin's local paper getting money, or is this hoovered up by a few people?
Yeah, that's an really important thing. So it was only the big guys, and so all the checks went only to the big publishers, and I'd say there were 8 or 9, maybe. Yeah, I think it probably went from the really big guys, the big broadcasters, 9, 7, and News Corp and others, probably came down as far as The Guardian and maybe a little bit lower, but, half a dozen, no more. Now, the point you raised is absolutely critical because what happened was that when this deal was done, the news industry that had been aligned to get to a single solution suddenly fragmented into fear and loathing. And so what happened was every small publisher and every publisher that wasn't included in the deals now was ringing and getting no response. And the platforms had no reason to give them any response.
Yeah.
And so their ability to negotiate was diminished from how bad it was. It was terrible before. Now it was non-existent.
Yeah.
And so all of these smaller publishers suddenly totally lost that lifeline.
And the smaller publishers in that world, they don't know at this point, with a week to go, whether they're actually going to be cut off or whether they're just going to be, there's no money for them, basically. So they've just lost, basically.
It's gone. The law's not going to be prosecuted because the big publishers have got a check. And so from the politicians' perspective, they've really taken a big a big political risk by stepping out onto the kind of end of the narrowest limb on
Yeah.
a tree to fight against big tech. Tiny little plucky Australia is going to fight big tech. And then the people they were trying to protect at the 11th hour then just kind of pulled the rug out from underneath them and took a check. Now, I want to be very fair in this. Like my personal opinion, I'll be very clear. My personal opinion is I just think that's cowardice. I think it was silly, and I don't think it provided them with any security whatsoever. And we'll talk about what happened since, because what I predicted would happen happened exactly, though they told me it wouldn't. But what I will say is this: is that if you are a big publisher and you're listed and you've got shareholders and you've got a lot of pressure on you, and you are, I'm sure they were promised the absolute world. You can have a baby pony at the same time if you like. You know, I'm sure they were offered absolutely everything. They took it, and I think there was I would say that there was a kind of FOMO element here, where people just, there's a pile-on and FOMO, fear of missing out type thing going on. And so they all took a check. Now, who made the decision to take the check, whether it was made domestically or globally, I don't know the answer to that. We can take a guess. But look, the truth is that what happened totally cut the legs off any possibility of Australia having a law that would be enacted, and totally cut the legs off 1,500 local publishers simultaneously at once, and left everybody in a much worse position. But then I will just add, before I go quiet and let you dive in for a bit, is that it also utterly killed any possibility of a similar law being enacted in other countries. And the ACCC here in Australia were talking to Canada, and they were talking to Europe, and these guys were all had the same law ready to go bang, 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 which is what the big tech companies were most worried about. And the only thing that would stop that happening and changing the world for funding for media was if the Australia deal didn't go through and the Australia law didn't happen. And the Australia law didn't happen, and as a result, we don't have anything like it anywhere on the planet.
No, so you're absolutely right. I mean, I was in London at the time. I was at News, and we had never paid more attention to Australian media than we did in the year kind of preceding this. Everybody,
you know that Rupert Murdoch's Australian, mate. And the only reason you've got that job is because he's Australian, right?
Yeah, we were frequently reminded about Australian media, but we weren't watching it minute by minute. Everybody, all the senior execs I knew at that point, everyone had a copy of that ACCC competition report, which is about thick as your
Very
arm.
good.
Yeah,
Great
very good
work.
report. But you're absolutely right. At that point, for the first time, it felt like the regulators in Australia, in the UK, in the EU, and in the US were exactly that, in lockstep. And one of them would publish something, and you'd see it referenced in the next report published by the next one. So this was absolutely going to go global if it had gone through. I think the other interesting bit is when we say people took a check, they sort of got two things at that point, didn't they? So they got a check, and that was for a finite amount of time. And they got a contract which said, in some cases, said things like, "Hey, you're going to use Google Analytics, or you're going to use Google Cloud, or we're going to have a partnership around Google News. You're going to have a partnership around Facebook, video, or so we're going to tie you in a little more to the product, but you're also confidentially bound not to release how much you just paid for this. You're not going to talk about the terms of the deal. You're not going to talk unfavorably about the companies. You're going to effectively that's what the price of the check is."
Yeah.
And the terms, how long were most of those deals for? A year, 2 years, kind of?
No, they were 3 years. So it was a 3-year deal. Google and Meta both signed up for a 3-year deal. And what you're absolutely right. So every single deal had a stipulation that you're not allowed to tell anybody what it is. And I can tell you one thing, right? After 35 years in journalism, and you know this, as a reporter, I have this incredible skeleton key for finding out secrets, and it's basically this. Yeah, and it works incredibly well. You take that pretty much to any journalist, and about 20 minutes later, their resolve completely clears, and they tell you what you want to know, right? But they didn't on this, and so you can see that I'm not. I think there was a combination of things here. I think there was a combination of I'm really terrified they might take it away. I think there was also I'm actually a little bit ashamed that I took it. Okay, and then the third one was I'm going to pretend that I got something really good, and that's going to absolve my conscience. Yeah. But what eventually transpired was that we figured out through osmosis, rumors, gossip, conversations, everybody kind of eventually consolidated on the belief that it was $200 million combined. About 150 million from Google and about 50 from Meta. Now,
Yeah.
in Australian terms, in print publishing, the total earnings of print publishers are 200 million. So
Yeah.
a check of that size is meaningful. But to be fair, 10 years ago, they were earning 4 times that. So
Yeah.
it's kind of, it's better than what you've got, but it's nothing like what you had, right?
No. And just for the avoidance of
yeah.
doubt, this is Aussie. This is all in Aussie dollars.
Yes, it is. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. And so everybody takes this check, and then for 3 years, which is 1,000 days, okay, it's not really talked about. And some of the publishers spend the money on some initiatives, but everybody's really, if this is one of the things that doesn't get talked about, so everybody was terrified to spend the money. And the reason they were terrified to spend the money was because if they spent it and hired people and then it didn't renew, they'd have to fire all those people and then it would be on them. So it's almost like having a toxic check. It's kind of like you have to sell your wedding ring in a divorce, right? You don't want to spend the money because it means something. And it was like, oh right, okay. So one of the publishers actually told me they'd never spent the check, even though they'd fought so hard for it and taken such a risk. They never spent the check. They just kept it. So when you think about it in that lens, the whole thing was just an absolute nightmare, and it ended up like a kind of contorted nightmare that gave 1,000 days to publishers. Now, soon after it happened, I went to see all the publishers and I said, look, you think it's $200 million. I don't think it is. I think it's 1,000 days. I think this is a window of opportunity for you to start to build for the future because they're not going to renew these deals. And they were like, they absolutely will renew the deals. And I was like, then they're not. Like, they're just not. And they were like, they will. And it's easy for me to say that now because now they have, Meta hasn't, but Google has, and we'll talk about that. So it's easy for me to say it now, and it looks like I'm saying it after the event. But I actually said it long before the event. So, 2-3 years ago, it's all on record in my newsletter, that I was saying they're not going to renew the deal. I was having meetings with Meta people who were saying to me, we're not going to renew it. It's not going to happen. Like, no one comes to Meta for the news. They just don't.
No.
I know you think they do. Yeah, but they don't. Like, news is 0.5% of what people use Meta for, but that 0.5% is your entire publishing industry. Yeah.
And I always thought it was very different. So I've always thought that Meta had a very different sort of starting point than Google, because as a publisher, Meta can say, I can stop you publishing. I can't stop people sharing links. And I'm just, I fall back on Section 2. I'm just a platform. Like, I'm not doing anything here. People come and post links to your news, and people come and navigate to it, and that's nothing to do with me. So I'm never going to pay you for the right to host things that other people publish that are just links to the internet. So you could see that they could construct something there. Google's slightly different because that it is very difficult for a publisher to say, well, we're not going to be on Google. It's basically discovery on the open web, and your price of being crawled by Google is that you appear on the internet effectively. So Google in the other way, if Google says we're going to stop news, it's a very different debate. So I do always think the two conversations are slightly different. I like thinking about, because let's say I sort of come out in support of the faceless suits making these decisions. I just think it's interesting when you think of that. If you think of let's say there's 10 publishers in here, and they rank from News Corp being kind of the big dog and Channel 7 being the big dog, down to your mid-level players, then out to the locals. And as that decision starts, so once the really interesting decision is Channel 7. The decision that everybody else then in that top tier has to make is different because Channel 7 have made their decision. Then after that, there's this kind of panic when you get down to like 6, 7, and 8 in that list. Am I going to be one of the people that actually gets a check?
Yeah.
So I'm completely incentivized to go quickly, right? Because I might be the last one to get one of these checks. There's a scramble there. And then you've got the guys at the bottom who are like, I just know that no one's ever going to write me a check for the Wollongong Express, right? It's just not happening. So I've been, as you say, I've been kicked out here. But I do think that the interesting ones are that Channel 7 decision. Who do you think made it?
Oh, mate, put me on the spot. Look, it can only have been made by the owner. At the end of the day, you can't make a strategic decision of that scale.
No.
And so Look, as kind of said earlier on, I have a certain sympathy with companies that don't have enough money to keep the lights on, who are
Mm.
absolutely terrified as to what the future looks like if search
Yeah,
doesn't exist and if Meta doesn't exist. How do
yeah,
what happens in our world? Now, from my perspective, okay, I've always been a bit of a risk taker. That's why I'm a tabloid editor, and so
mm.
I actually love. I see two things. I'm really, really simple. A and B. There's monopoly and there's chaos. And given those two, I'd rather have chaos.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I think I can back myself to win in chaos.
mm.
Yeah. But I have no chance to win in monopoly. Right. So it's
Yeah,
0 or 1. I'll take one, thanks. Yeah. And so I would have done that. But if you're listed and you have, $100 million revenues and you have shareholders and you're being judged every single day, that's a harder decision to make. So
yeah,
I do have
yeah,
some respect for that, okay? But what I think, going back, if I had a time machine to take you back to where the mood of the world was at this moment when these decisions were taken, the tech companies had been led down a cul-de-sac and they had
mm.
walked down this cul-de-sac because the ACCC had said this law's happening. They're facing a law that's going to be really painful globally and incredibly expensive and probably have an impact on their annual global earnings forever,
Yeah, yeah,
right? Or I can throw a ton of money at it, get it gone, and then I've got optionality, right? So, but I'm going down this path, and the government's making it really clear that there is no way out of here. And
yeah,
if all of the publishers stand firm behind me and continue to usher me down this dead end, I've got no way out of here.
mm.
Okay, I've got nowhere out. And I think the way that the ACCC and Rod Sims and the government and everybody had put it together was so clever. It reminds me so much of the DOJ and the way they did the antitrust case against Google
Mm.
because they covered off all the exits and it left
Yeah,
you in this cul-de-sac. There's nowhere to go, right? Unless someone lets you out. So the only way they could get out is if they were let out, and then they were let out.
yeah,
And that model would have worked for the whole world. Now, I think the publishing industry would be in an entirely different place today had that not happened. And so Australia, by going first, had to show the courage and the fortitude to stand not for Australia, but for the whole
yeah,
world.
yeah.
And it fell. And
And
I'm very disappointed about it.
so just remind me exactly the date that it all crumbled.
Oh, early 2020. Yeah.
Um, yeah. So the background, I guess, also to bear in mind is that at that point, I mean, the print market in Australia is struggling at that point. Print advertising's, really having a tough time. The
Yeah, been
economics of
struggling
print, yeah.
forever.
So
Yeah.
so I can kind of, as you say, you've got two decisions being made. One is the publisher saying, I'm particularly talking about kind of news and mag publishers more than I'm talking about broadcast TV, but they're kind of saying, as you say, 3 years certainty of this check, which basically bridges for me another period where I'm trying to digitize. Yes, I
Yeah.
know I'm not. I know I'm not setting a long term precedent, and I probably know I'm not doing the knight in shining armor kind of right thing. But I've got a whole team. I've got a leadership team here who are bonused annually. I've got I've got a bunch of people that I want to keep employing. I need to hire a new video editor because we've got to do all those Facebook reels. And so so that's quite a local decision. And you're right that the platforms are looking at this. This is a global chess game, and we're basically we've got to get out of the checkmate over here because this could cost us billions if this what would you guess? I'm going to just put you on the spot slightly, but what would you guess the value in Australia, let's say, is 200 million? You take that to the UK, you take that to the European market, you take that to the US market. We're into multiple billions, 2, 3 billion,
Four. Four.
four.
Yeah, so I've run the numbers. So it would have been pro rata for the rest of those markets, would have been about $4 billion. Now, interestingly enough, if you take the research that the Washington Post and the New York Times both did, and the Pew Research Center did a couple of years ago, they estimated that the total loss to publishing globally was about $4 billion a year. And
Yeah,
so, interestingly, it would have taken basically publishing back to where it was in kind of 2010. So
yeah,
it would have been a revival. Yeah. Yeah. Now you have to remember that we don't know how the tech companies would have reacted if that had happened. They could have killed search, they could have removed all news, they could have thrown their toys out of the
yeah,
pram. They would have
Yeah.
appealed forever and a day. You can imagine what would have happened.
Yes.
And also, let's be clear, right, that this was a politically motivated, there was political self-interest in here, but it doesn't take terribly long to wait out a political era, does it? I
Yeah.
mean, you've
No.
got somebody in and they're super aggressive in their first year, they're slightly more careful in the second year, they're in election mode in the third year, and so all you have to do is just wait them out until they lose and then give something to the people coming in. So that's exactly
Yeah.
what's happening in Canada at the moment, right? So you've got a probable change of government in Canada at the moment. The Canadian government that's still in power at the moment is really clear about forcing Google to pay $100 million a year to publishers. Canada said it's not playing ball at all. That law, the government said, this is in perpetuity, this law, right? I remember when she said it on the press conference, it was like, in perpetuity. I was like, yeah, I don't know how you can claim that because I'm not sure you're going to be in power in
Yeah.
perpetuity.
Yeah.
And so, sure enough, it looks like they're going to be tumbled in this coming election. And the new, the prime minister in waiting, the guy who's the favourite to take it, has already said he's going to get rid of it. So it was
Yeah.
perpetuity for a year and a half.
Yeah.
That's not the same thing. I'm going to have to get my thesaurus out and just make sure that's not exactly the same thing. So we always have the problem that big tech is global and effectively not permanent, but going to be 20, 30 years, okay? And you're
Yeah.
fighting against people that have self-interest that might only exist for 18 months, and publishers that are desperate to meet the next 100 days, let alone the next 100 years, okay?
Yeah.
And so all of that creates the imbalance that means you can't win. And the only thing that protects you from that, and this is where I get on my high horse a bit, the only thing that protects you on that is the law, because the law is designed to work above any of those short-term issues. It's designed to be, we've been working on this for 4,000 years and we've groomed it and fixed it and cleaned it and changed it and taken case law all the way through to today. And as a result, the outcome is law says this and you have to abide by it or you cannot operate. That we were there. We were just going to tip over onto the other side of law.
Yeah.
And then we didn't. And that gave you no protection. And we should talk about what then happened. But we had the chance to put ourselves on the other side of the safety net, and we didn't. And we blew it for everyone.
Yeah. And in doing so, as you say, set no precedents. So because it never turned into law, but also because the contract never referred to. I mean, most of those contracts will have referred to partnerships. It would have been a partnership deal. They would have been extremely careful because they're super smart. So they would have been extremely careful to make sure that none of them ever said we're paying you for distribution of news. This would have been, as you say, a marketing partnership. It's a beautiful union of two great brands, and these contracts will set no legal precedent at all. Which is why 3 years later, because no precedent's been set, the renewal term is entirely in the ballpark of the platform rather than a mutual negotiation based on some kind of legal footing.
A precedent was set. The precedent was that the law, these people will buckle before it comes to the law. That was the precedent that was set. Yeah. So what then happened, for everybody that doesn't know, was the payments were made. 3-year deals were signed. A 3-year entente cordiale existed. There was there were lots of meetings and lots of people sitting down and talking to each other. There was, various Google handouts and the Google News Initiative, and Meta was here, there, and everywhere, and but it wasn't really a friendship. It was kind of like it was tense. Yeah, every newsroom had a Google initiative, and they were putting trainees through the Google initiative, and they were all being trained up how to work on Google search. I mean, it was I don't know. Anyway, look, nothing I'm going to say is going to be positive. So I'm going to try and focus on the positives here. Okay, is that it gets to 3 years, and about a year out, and as I said to you, I'm having lunch with a Google, a Meta exec down by the harbour here. We have a lovely harbour in Sydney, by the way. It's absolutely lovely. And he basically says to me, "There's no way we're going to renew. It's just not going to happen. Like, we've moved on. What we needed to do was to make sure that the law didn't happen. And now we've got optionality. 3 years is up. We've paid the money. No one really cares about news on our platform. And so we're not going to pay for something that people don't want, and we're just not going to have it. And so we're moving on. We're into AI now. The whole world's moved on. Why would we pay for old news publishers here? It's not our problem. And like, frankly, you didn't say this, but frankly, the government's not going to back the publishers now after they kind of
Yeah.
did the
Yeah.
dirty on last time. And the guy that was running the ACCC, who we were genuinely scared of, is gone. So, like, happy days. We're not going to pay again. And so I asked lots and lots of publishers and executives in the publishers, whether they thought Meta would renew, and they were all adamant that they were going to renew, even up to like 3 weeks before. They're talking to us. They're saying they're really interested. They're offering some new initiatives. There's this new stuff that they're doing. It's all going to be great. And I was like, that's not what they're telling me. Like, and so I would warn that they are going to tell you that, right? And if they're telling me something different, I'm here trying to offer some help. But no one listened. Everybody was absolutely adamant. And then when the shoe dropped, when they basically said, no, we're out, the reaction was one of shock. But none of them were as shocked as I was shocked that they were shocked, right? Because it was like, I couldn't possibly understand how anybody could be so strategically naive to, if you do any kind of reading or research at all on what Meta's strategy is at this point, none of it mentions news. You can go and have a look at their last 25 earnings reports and do a keyword search for the word news, and you'll get crickets, right?
Yeah.
So it made no sense. Of course they weren't going to renew. So when they didn't renew, immediately the publishers were all up in arms and back at the government saying, you've got to do something here, you've got to do something. And so so that was like, we're gonna push the government to help us. But the government had moved on as well. Okay, so we were into a different political party in a different phase of its time. And the country had been to the brink. And it's very difficult to go there, come back, and then jump back there again, right? It's not the hokey pokey, right? We're trying to do something actually really meaningful here. And so what then happened was Meta dropped out. And the government was asked to basically rule that Meta was now in breach of the law, and to make them pay. But the government said they would review it and they'd look at it. And then the minister that was in charge of it was talking really strongly about it. Then he stepped down. So then suddenly he was gone. And then, so we've seen all this before, right? All over the world. You've seen it in the UK, right? Like 3 generations of this, really, in most governments in the world.
I think in the UK, we have had, at last count, I think we've had 10 culture ministers in 7 years. I might not be exactly right, but it's something like that. And it's almost like the role that as soon as any new government comes in, anybody gets promoted, they change the culture minister, which means that, as you say, the government, in theory, you sort of think of the government and the law as being very permanent, and companies kind of coming and going. Actually, what we've seen in this is that the platforms have been incredibly kind of steady. Publishers have been quite volatile, but the government's all over the place. We had 5 prime ministers and, as I say, 10 culture ministers in the period of time we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem, right? And I also think that, as media companies, real strategy, I mean, not how can I increase my CPM by 0.3%? I mean, like real, actual 10-year growth strategy isn't a conversation that happens in boardrooms anymore. The conversation is basically about the next quarter and how we're going to deliver a number. It's become a widget machine. And, I've sat in those strategy meetings, as have you, right? Where there are actual proper strategy meetings about actual things we're going to do. We're going to buy this company. We're going to enter into this space. We're going to start a cable TV network. I remember sitting in some meetings on that, right? We're going to buy MySpace. I've been in some of these, really big strategic conversations, but strategy is not really talked about. And so when you're thinking about the next 30 minutes and they're thinking about the next 30 years, it's a different conversation, okay? And it gets derailed. So what happened?
Sorry, just on that point, I do think it's interesting to think about. I mean, as you say, I've sat in a lot of those conversations, and it is interesting to think about if the entire news industry was digital pure play, I think those conversations would be different.
Yeah.
I think one of the things you're always conscious of when you're sitting doing the kind of business planning, let's call it business planning, kind of like 12 to 18 months rather than kind of 5-year, 10-year strategy. One of the things you're always conscious of is you are going to be losing money out of your left hand, which is the print business, the legacy business, probably the legacy broadcast, business is not dissimilar. And so what you're always in, you've got to grow the digital business as fast as you can. You've got to get revenue, but you have to get margin. And so part of the reason that those checks are so attractive is they're 100% margin. They drop straight to the bottom line because there's no cost attached to them. Whereas
Yeah.
every other thing that you're trying to do in that 12 to 18-month period comes with cost. You've got to have engineers, you've got to have product people, you've got to have marketing people, you've got acquisition costs, you've got customer service costs, and blah, blah, blah. So everything in the digital growth space, it takes a few years to grow margin. And that's why I think those checks are so seductive, because it's 100% increasing your digital margin. So
A
I do
bit
wonder
like the illegal monopoly check that Google gave to Apple, so it would be on the iPhone, 100% margin, is that right?
yeah,
Yeah. So let me ask you, right? So you were the managing director at the Times, and you're
yeah.
CEO of Bauer Media, right? What would you have done? No
It's a good
pressure.
question. No. Well, it's fine. In retrospect, I'd have been a hero. Honestly, well, firstly, let's be honest. You mentioned this earlier. So even as kind of the MD of the Times, the decisions to operate with the platforms are happening at a global level. So this is happening at the kind of owner level. Same thing with Bauer, because there's such big decisions, and because they happen in every jurisdiction simultaneously. So actually, what you would do as the MD of the Times or the MD of the Sun is different than you'd possibly do as the Journal, or you'd do as the Post, or you'd do as the Daily Telegraph in Sydney. And so actually a lot of it goes up to quite a small group of people who are kind of, in the ear of the owner. So firstly, I would have, I probably would have had to recognize it wasn't a decision I was going to make. I think I've been in so many of these conversations where you are trying to hold together the whole of the publishing, sort of your local domestic publishing industry. We're seeing it. We've been doing it the last couple of weeks with copyright. You've seen it with AI, where actually exactly the same thing has happened here, which is that at the start of the conversation, we're all going to stand shoulder to shoulder, and gradually somebody cracks and signs the first deal. And then it becomes a little bit of at that point, all of your decision making changes. So I think my honest answer is, I'm not sure I would have been the first one. I wouldn't maybe have been the Channel 7. But as soon as I heard about the Channel 7, I mean, your options by then are so limited that you kind of probably have to follow it in and feel bad about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm at pains to kind of make this clear. I understand why they did it.
Yeah.
I do, but I just worry that the global implication of a local decision was so significant
Yeah.
that it's I spent quite a lot of time in Canada this year, sitting down and chatting to local publishers there. They talk about Rod Sims, the head of the Australian ACCC, as some godlike figure because
Yeah.
he stood up for them, right? And then they all talk dirty about Australian publishers.
Yeah.
And so the reputation of the Australian media industry globally has been tarnished by this decision. Yeah. And
Did Rod Sims ever talk about it? Have you ever talked to Rod Sims about it? Has he ever sort of?
yeah, he's been he plays his cards very close to his chest. So he
Yeah.
tends to write op-eds, yeah, and not in Australia.
Right.
So you'll see his op-ed. So, for example, he wrote an op-ed recently in the Globe and Mail in Canada, and it's very careful. He's very smart, and it basically says things like, what we managed to do was we forced the big tech companies to negotiate a cash deal with publishers. So the News Media Bargaining Code was a win. Yeah. So that that $200 million would never have been handed over had we not done this. So net, it's a win. It's not the win that he well, I don't know what he wanted, but it's not the net win that we would have had if a law had been passed and a precedent set. But it was still a win. It was $200 million the publishers would not have got if he hadn't done his job. Now, I think that's right. And I also think it's quite a nice little way for him to go into retirement, to say that I won $200 million. If they didn't renew, not really my problem, I've retired. So I think everybody ended up, and again, I suspect that in the war rooms of Google and Meta. Yeah, they were running 300 different scenarios on how this would play out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they will have figured out that if a publisher took a check, everybody kind of won a little bit. And if no one took a check, then the big tech guys would lose. So the only way that everybody won was if they managed to persuade one to say yes. So they just pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed on the weakest point until they got them to say yes. And I think if I was on the other side of the fence, that's probably how I'd have played it too.
And this is Clegg era Meta, isn't it? So one of the guys advising Meta at this point was the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK. I mean, they understand exactly how government works. They're very well resourced, very smart. But you're absolutely right. If you were negotiating from that side of the table, you'd have done exactly what they did.
Yeah. So let's talk about where we are. So it's now a year since Meta pulled out, and when Meta did pull out, one of the things that happened was very, very quickly. It was kind of interesting how quickly this happened. Google was immediately on the front foot saying, "We're not cancelling." Okay, just so you know, we're not cancelling. They were on TV, they were on the radio. We're not cancelling. And I thought that was really interesting because at the time, again, you need a time machine. These stories can only really be told if you've recorded the moment, you've distilled that moment in your mind, which is why I love writing a newsletter, is because I can go back to any of those dates and go, this was what was happening on that day, I remember. And so on that particular time, Google was right in the middle of the antitrust trials. It had lost two, and it was going into the third, and it was looking shaky in the third. And I remember they came out and they said, we're going to renew. And I've been on several boards. I know you have as well. I've had my own board on my own company. And I know what fiduciary responsibility means, okay? And when you're a board, it seems a really easy job. For all of you that are listening, by the way, that think you want to be a really, really well-paid board director and think that's a nice job because you only have to work one day a month, it's not really like that. There's all kinds of really painful, scary things that might happen to you, like being sued for gazillions of dollars or going to jail. And so I remember watching them say, we're going to renew and we're going to keep paying. And I remember thinking at the time that you're about to be antitrusted. You've already been declared an illegal monopoly twice. And it's looking likely that it's going to be declared an illegal monopoly the third time. I'm not sure that you're able to say that you're going to continue to pay $150 million to these publishers because I don't think you know what your revenue is going to be. If there's a structural separation of your company, if your ad tech company is taken away from you, which is one of the remedies that's been asked for in this, if you are no longer allowed to optimize AdX and GAM to put additional revenue on your owned and operated sites and you have to share it transparently, I don't know that you can make a promise to continue to pay this. Your shareholders would be absolutely right to step up and go, who's going to pay this $150 million? Yeah. And so I said to a lot of the publishers at the time, they can't make this promise. It feels very, very dodgy. And they were like, no, they're adamant they're going to renew. But what they did do, they did renew, but they renewed for 12 months, not for 3. For 3 years.
Same kind of level of payment?
Yeah, no one knows. It's top secret. But, I'd be willing to bet you, this very, very delicious bottle of scotch for Scotch and Watch, which I haven't managed to show you yet. Okay, but I will now show you. How's your tea?
Great.
I'm willing to bet you that bottle of scotch that they won't have paid more. Okay. So I think that's a safe. I think I'm safe with my scotch.
I'm not taking that bet.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think they would have paid less because $150 million isn't a game-changing amount of money for them here. I think that would have just added, kind of poured some petrol on the fire. But what you got was another year. Okay, so it was 3, now it's 1. But as I'm watching these antitrust trials roll over, and I'm watching the mood of Google change, and I'm watching them go to more AI-delivered search, and I'm watching them roll down less and less traffic to publishers. I think they're 40% down. And I'm watching AdX come down and the money they're sharing with third parties going down. I've said to so many people, and I mean it in good faith, right? They're not going to renew, right? And even if they do renew one more time, you are just on borrowed time. Your entire future is reliant on somebody that doesn't have you in their future plans at all. And I think that's deeply troubling. And so the publishing industry, and we should spend some time thinking about what should you do as the publishers, because it's so depressing sometimes to think about all of this and just think you're being constantly outgunned. And we have been outmaneuvered and we've made some strategic errors and we've talked about some of them
Yeah.
today. And we've taken the short term option, not the long term win. But what do you do? What is the plan B? Because we need this ship we're on, the Google
Yeah.
ship, is going down. Okay?
Yeah.
Or it's leaving port without us. What do we do?
Hang on a sec. We've got a question there.
Yeah, go for it.
They said, have you guys seen or talked about the Surf browser by Flipboard? It's relevant to this conversation. And we got another
Yeah.
question from earlier that said, I stood in front of 500. This is from Justin Scarborough. I stood in front of 500 publishers in the US, told them they were writing their own eulogy if they were focusing on UID and how to sell their data to the lowest bidder. So,
Yeah.
let's do Surf browser by Flipboard. Have you seen it?
Nate. Yeah. I've seen it. So look, let's continue the ships leaving the port analogy, right?
Yeah.
You want to be on the ship you want to be on, right? And that these guys do not want you on. That you're a stowaway as far as the Google ship's gone. It's going away. Its future is going to be on creating AI answers, trying
Yep.
to hide behind fair use to drive as much margin as possible and as much ad revenue as possible on their owned and operated platform. They are shareholder first, publisher
Mm-hmm.
second. Shareholder first, profit first, product second, publisher 278th. Yeah. And so I just don't think that we play a part in their future, right? And so we have to get onto something else. Now, there are going to be a series of smart new companies that are going to pop up that are going to help news content because people still want the news and still want information. We're going to have to discover it in new ways with AI and new
Mm-hmm.
UX and new discovery and new monetization. And there's going to be I'm hoping for things like Surf and others, that people are going to come up with new and innovative ways to help people
Yeah.
find access to that information. I don't really want the publishing's future to be built by OpenAI, which feels an awful lot like Google in waiting.
Yeah.
So I would like to think that now we can start to take control. We talked about this in our first call.
Yeah.
If you don't control discovery, distribution, and monetization, what do you do?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think, you would hope, this is part of the reason we have these conversations, I think, is just to go back and, these decisions, as you say, these decisions get made in a fury at the time. They're tremendously difficult decisions to make at the time. But in hindsight, the lesson that we all have to be learning is even if you do those deals, they don't last. And, when you do them, they're never quite, they don't give you a strategic solution to the problem that you've got, which is distribution monetization. They give you a temporary kind of period they give you a temporary salve. Free sneeze for every reader. So the lesson that we have to have learned is that increasingly you can see this with AI overviews in Google starting to reduce the traffic. We've all seen Facebook traffic, Google traffic come down. We've all seen kind of what's happened to X. Any strategy right now that is purely driven by the benevolence of off-platform is crazy. The lesson has to have been learned in the 4 or 5 different rounds of, oh, maybe this time. Oh no, maybe this time I'm going to spin up a team. We're going to do something because we got to. That's crazy. So I think that's the real challenge for publishers: is how do they both have a team of people who really understand how to get the best possible result out of the relationship with platforms, and I include in that AI platforms, generative search platforms, the kind of wave of agents that's going to come around the corner, but also try and use the kind of what's coming in, particularly that DOJ. If the DOJ breakup actually goes through, it creates this chink of light where suddenly, examples like browser competition, different kind of trying to think about search competition suddenly gives you an opportunity to think about that in different ways. And so I think I'm pretty convinced that say publishers, it's like fool me once. This is more like fool me like 9 times. Then I kind of get the message that we have to be a little more resilient. The other thing I'd say is that I have never seen the copyright example from the other week. I've never seen the whole of the creative industry organize itself as effectively to get a single message across to government and actually to collaborate and to genuinely communicate with each other, understanding that we are not competitors in that particular conversation. That message has definitely landed. I still think going back even to 2020, half of that is kind of, in Australia, exactly who your competition is, and you want to get a bigger check than the other guy. And there's still that kind of internal competition with publishers. My sense is that has more than ever been kind of driven out of these conversations. It's very clear that the competition is between, publishers and platforms rather than publishers themselves. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I'm going to go a step further though, which is that we just have the wrong leadership. So I think the problem that we've got, and many of these people are my friends, by the way. The reason that I left my big, well-paid job in big media was to go to big tech and learn what they were doing that we weren't doing. So I was well armed to know how to defend the industry I loved most. I effectively went undercover when I became an executive at Microsoft. That was basically what I was doing. I was going to learn what they were doing because I cared more about the journalism than I did about the money, and I always have. Okay? And so when I look at the leaders that are running our industry these days, none of them have ever worked in tech. None of them have got Snap on their phone. None of them have ever looked at what a CPM is or worked out how to arbitrage it. None of them have ever written a single line of code. And certainly none of them have ever run an AI company when AI is the entire future of our industry. It's a bit like being a coal miner in the space race. Yeah, it's not particularly useful. Okay. And so I think that, what we need to see here is that there is a transitional time taking place. We're probably 2 generations too slow, and this is the last generation to make the switch. So I think that we need to put our hands down our pants and discover who we are and go, do you know what? I'm going to get in this fight. Yeah. And we've failed to do this again and again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
And my problem is, now, I gave a presentation today to a whole lot, not today, this week, to a whole load of people in a room about effectively change. And it was basically about the fact that if you say no, no makes you stupid. All right. And everybody in the room was like, what's he on about? And I said, well, look, let me give you an example. When a 5-year-old kid in school is asked what 5 plus 7 is, and they don't know the answer, they don't say no. They ask the teacher. The teacher tells them they learn, they now know what the answer is, and they can answer the question. If you go to the boardroom of a major media company and say, you should do something in AI, they say no. The kid is wiser than the board of experts. Because the answer can't be no, because the outcome of no is definite failure. And the answer of anything else is a chance of success. So if you say no, you are guaranteeing you lose. And as I said on stage, death is not a viable business position. Okay? You have to think of something better than no.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to create an era of yes. And to create an era of yes, you need a new blood. And you need new people thinking differently, who are younger and more switched on to this future. We need digital natives, but not just digital natives. We actually need people that are actually living in the future that's coming. Yeah. Their brain is there. And we don't have that. And I think that you can't possibly win if you've got yesterday's champion trying to build tomorrow's success.
Well, there you go. That's almost brought us to. I think I'll live for this week with the visual metaphor of putting my hand down my pants and being ready to fight. That's some.
Somebody said to me the other day, they said, Ricky, you're a bit of a fighter, you're a bit of a brawler. And I said, I am. And they said, do you not get into trouble? I said, you see, I come, for those of you who don't know me, I come from a council estate in Bristol, which is kind of a rough, tough kind of estate in the UK. And so, I kind of grew up as a kind of a brawler in school. That's kind of who I am, and it's kind of stuck with me. It's why I went to tabloids and didn't go to one of those posh papers. And so I said to them, I said, look, if you come from the wrong side of the tracks and you're a bit of a brawler, you learn that the best way to win a fight is to do this. You can go in the pub and you can start the brawl. That's okay. You can start a pub. I'm very, very good at starting a pub brawl. But when the police arrive, you need to be down the road at the chip shop.
Yeah.
And that's what strategy is. Okay. Yeah. There is a pub brawl underway. Okay. And we need to work out who's the fighters, and who are the strategists. And at the moment, we look like a one-trick pony, and we're just being outmaneuvered by these tech companies who've got people who are thinking in a 20-year version, not in
Yeah,
a 100-day to the next reporting cycle. We will get there. I'm confident we'll get there. And Sam, I love your question. Do I think publishers
yeah,
have figured this out? I don't think they have. And when I ask the staff when I'm at events and I ask them what they think about their bosses, they never reply in public, but they all reply privately at the coffee machine. And it's not good feedback. And so I think that that is a signal that we need some
yeah. I,
refreshing.
I'm a little more optimistic. I think at the very least we've stopped fighting each other in the pub. And so that's kind of the beginning. I think more people are kind of wondering, to stretch this metaphor, more people are wondering whether there are going to be any chips in the future.
Mm.
And so yeah, I see a little bit of a turn. I'm more optimistic about the leadership than you are, Ricky, but that's us.
Mate, look at me. I've moved on. I'm a writer, not a fighter these days, right? There we go. All right, let's leave it there. We'll find something else to talk about next week. Thank you, everybody, for tuning
Thank you.
in and listening. And look, we're back every Friday night at 7 p.m. For me and 8 a.m. for Chris. Me with a scotch, him with a cup of tea, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much for joining. See ya.
Thank you. Bye bye.